"You can handle all 5 of us?" said the widows when the mountain man inherited their ranch. The bell in Silver Bluff tolls. A dusty street falls silent, and a lone rider arrives to claim land he never asked for. But inside that weather-worn ranch house wait 5 widows, 5 lives bound together by loss, and a single question. Can one man carry them all? He came down from the mountains with nothing but his word. They gave him a home filled with grief and hope. Yet just as trust begins to grow, thunder of hooves brings trouble. The railroad wants their land, and a deputy with cold eyes brings eviction papers. As winter closes in, a young widow falls ill, and the only medicine lies beyond the river, in the hands of an Apache healer with secrets of her own. Now this quiet mountain man must fight greed, sickness, and his own doubts, to keep a promise made to the dead. Can one man protect 5 widows against the railroad's iron grip? Or will Riverbend Ranch be torn apart forever? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The morning sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's main street as Gideon Hawley pulled his horse to a stop in front of the weather-beaten law office. Dust settled around his boots as he dismounted, his movements stiff from the long ride down from his mountain cabin. The brass nameplate on the door read, "Theodore Mills, Attorney at Law," its surface dulled by years of desert wind. Inside, the office smelled of leather-bound books and old paper. A small clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking time in the quiet room. The lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, shuffled through a stack of documents on his desk. "Mr. Hawley," Mills said, gesturing to a wooden chair. "Thank you for coming so promptly." Gideon remained standing, his hat held loosely in his weathered hands. "Your letter said it was urgent." "Indeed." Mills pulled out a formal-looking document. "I regret to inform you that your friend Luke Barlow passed away 3 weeks ago. Fever took him quick." The words hit Gideon like a physical blow. He and Luke had fought side by side in the war, saved each other's lives more times than he could count. His throat tightened. "Luke was a good man. He thought highly of you as well, Mr. Howell. In fact," Mills adjusted his spectacles, "he named you inheritor of Riverbend Ranch." Gideon's head snapped up. "That's prime cattle land. Must be near 3,000 acres. 3,240 to be precise." Mills cleared his throat. "But there's something else you should know. The ranch comes with certain obligations." "Obligations?" 5 women currently reside there. Widows, all of them Barlow family by marriage. Luke's sister-in-law among them. Gideon's fingers tightened on his hat brim. "Widows? Yes. The war and various misfortunes have left them alone. Luke was their protector. Now, according to his will, that responsibility falls to you." The room seemed to shrink around Gideon. He'd expected land, maybe some cattle, not people. Not women depending on him. He'd spent years alone in his mountain cabin for good reason. "Surely there's someone else," he said gruffly. "Someone more suited." Mills shook his head. Luke was specific. "He trusted you, Mr. Hawley. Said you were the only man he knew who'd do right by them." Gideon walked to the window, staring out at the dusty street. The weight of Luke's trust pressed down on him like a physical thing. He thought of their time in the war, of promises made around campfires, of the debt he owed his friend. "These women," he said finally, "they know about this arrangement? They've been informed. Though I imagine they're as uncertain about it as you are." Gideon nodded slowly. "I reckon I'll ride out there today, see what needs doing." "The ranch is about 4 hours' ride southeast," Mills said, relief evident in his voice. "Follow the river past the old Thompson place." As Gideon mounted up, the afternoon sun was already sliding toward the western hills. He made camp that evening by a small stream, his bedroll spread beneath a stand of cottonwoods. The spring air carried a hint of chill, and the crackling fire did little to warm the unease in his gut. He stared up at the stars, remembering nights spent with Luke during the war, sharing coffee and quiet conversations. Luke had been the kind of man who could make you believe in better things, even in the darkest times. Now he was gone, leaving Gideon with a responsibility he'd never asked for and wasn't sure he could handle. 5 widows. 5 women who'd already lost everything once, now dependent on a stranger. Gideon ran a hand over his beard, feeling the weight of their unknown faces in his thoughts. He'd lived alone so long, the silence of the mountains his only companion. What did he know about taking care of womenfolk? But a promise was a promise, even one made by proxy through a dead man's will. Luke had believed in him, trusted him with the most precious thing he had. His family died as the fire died down to embers. Gideon pulled his blanket tighter. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. For now he had miles of thinking ahead of him, and a sky full of stars that offered no answers to his troubles. The coyotes called in the distance, their lonely songs echoing his own uncertainty about what awaited him at Riverbend Ranch. But he'd given his word, silent though it was, and that would have to be enough. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold as Gideon saddled his horse. The animal nickered softly, breath steaming in the cool morning air. He secured his bedroll behind the saddle, checking the cinch one final time before mounting up. The morning dew had left everything damp, and his boots were already wet from walking through the tall grass. The sun climbed higher as they crossed the dry plains, hooves kicking up dust from the parched earth. Scattered clouds drifted overhead, offering brief moments of shade. By mid-morning, the heat had settled in, and Gideon's shirt stuck to his back beneath his worn leather vest. They forded 3 creeks before noon, the water running clear and cold over stone. At the second crossing, Gideon paused to let his horse drink and refill his own canteen. The water tasted of minerals and earth, refreshing after hours in the saddle. The afternoon found them following old cattle trails, worn deep into the land by years of use. Gideon noticed the occasional broken fence post or rusty piece of farm equipment, signs of the working ranch ahead. Prairie grass swayed in the warm breeze, and meadowlarks called from hidden perches. It was late afternoon when Riverbend Ranch finally came into view. The 2-story house stood weathered but proud against the backdrop of distant hills. Smoke curled from the chimney, and lamplight glowed warmly in the windows. A barn stood off to one side, its red paint faded by sun and wind. The whole scene spoke of home and hearth, making Gideon's solitary mountain cabin seem stark in comparison. He dismounted at the front gate, leading his horse up the packed earth path to the house. His spurs jingled with each step, announcing his arrival. Taking a deep breath, he climbed the wooden steps and knocked on the door. The sound echoed like thunder in his ears. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then came the soft sound of footsteps, and the door opened just enough to reveal several pairs of wary eyes peering out at him. "Evening," Gideon said, hat in hand. "I'm Gideon Hawley." The door opened wider, revealing 5 women standing in the entrance hall. They ranged in age from perhaps 20 to 50, all dressed in simple cotton dresses and aprons. Their faces were guarded, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Come through to the kitchen," said one of them. A tall woman with graying hair pulled back severely from her face. Her voice carried authority, marking her as a natural leader among them. Gideon followed them into a large kitchen warmed by a cookstove. The smell of beef stew filled the air, making his stomach remind him he hadn't eaten since morning. The women arranged themselves around the room, some leaning against counters, others sitting at the worn wooden table. The tall woman, who he would soon learn was Sarah Barlow, crossed her arms and fixed him with a direct stare. "So," she said sharply, "you can handle all 5 of us?" A few of the other women chuckled uneasily at her boldness, but their eyes remained serious, testing his reaction. Gideon shifted his weight, unused to being the center of such focused attention. "Maid." "A promise to Luke," he said simply, his voice rough from disuse. "Aim to keep it." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, measuring the worth of his words. After a long moment, she nodded toward the stove. "Supper's ready. Might as well eat while we talk." The meal was served in tin bowls, rich beef stew with chunks of potato and carrot. They sat around the large table, the silence broken only by the clink of spoons and the occasional murmured request to pass the bread. Gideon could feel their sideways glances, their quiet judgments of this bearded stranger who had suddenly become their protector. Attempts at conversation fell flat. Questions about his mountain cabin received short answers. Queries about his plans for the ranch met with non-committal grunts. The women exchanged glances across the table, their concerns obvious in their faces. When the meal was finished, Sarah stood. "There's space in the barn for your horse. We keep it clean for when we have guests." Her tone made it clear that guests was all he was for now. Gideon nodded his thanks and excused himself. As he crossed the yard to the barn, he could hear the low murmur of voices from the house behind him. No doubt they were discussing their new situation, and him. The barn was indeed clean, with fresh hay in the stalls. As he settled his horse for the night, he could make out fragments of conversation drifting through the evening air from the house's open windows. "Can we trust him? He seems awful quiet. Luke must have had his reasons, but a stranger?" Gideon spread his bedroll in an empty stall, the fresh hay crackling beneath it. The whispered doubts of the widows echoed in his mind as darkness settled over Riverbend Ranch. He had kept his promise to Luke by coming here, but earning the trust of 5 uncertain women would prove a far greater challenge than any mountain he had ever climbed. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when the sharp rhythm of an axe split the dawn silence. Thwack, thwack. The steady sound drew curious faces to the windows of Riverbend Ranch. Sarah Barlow stepped onto the front porch, a shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. There stood Gideon, his broad shoulders swinging the axe in smooth arcs. Already, a neat pile of split wood grew beside the chopping block. Without a word or glance toward the house, he set another log and brought the axe down clean through its center. The other widows joined Sarah on the porch, steam rising from their coffee cups. They watched as Gideon moved from the woodpile to the broken corral, hefting posts and mending rails with practiced efficiency. His movements were sure and economical, wasting no motion. "Well, Martha," the youngest widow whispered, "he surely knows his way around ranch work." Gideon worked steadily through the morning, speaking only when necessary to request tools or materials. His matter-of-fact manner and clear competence began to ease some of the tension from the previous evening. By mid-morning, the women had gathered in the kitchen. The coffee pot bubbled on the stove, filling the air with its rich aroma. Sarah was just pouring fresh cups when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A sleek bay horse carried its rider up to the house. The man who dismounted wore a tailored suit that seemed out of place against the rustic backdrop of the ranch. He removed his hat with a flourish, revealing perfectly combed hair and a practiced smile. "Ladies," he called out, climbing the porch steps, "I'm Jefferson Carver, representing the railroad company." His voice was smooth as creek stones, but something cold lurked beneath its surface. Sarah opened the door, but kept her hand firm on its edge. "What brings you out this way, Mr. Carver?" Carver's smile widened as he produced a leather folder from his jacket. "Just a small matter of property verification. The railroad has certain interests in this region. I'll need to see proof of ownership for Riverbend Ranch." The women exchanged worried glances. Luke's death had been sudden, and paperwork had never been their concern while he lived. "The deed's being processed," Sarah said carefully. "Our lawyer has the documents." "How unfortunate," Carver replied, his smile never wavering. "Because you see, the railroad has a legal claim to this land. been properly filed and everything. He patted his leather folder. Without clear proof of ownership, well, he let the threat hang in the air. Panic spread through the kitchen like a winter chill. Each widow knew what losing the ranch would mean: destitution, separation, the end of the only life they knew. Creak of boots on the porch boards announced Gideon's arrival. He filled the doorway, his presence solid as oak. Trail dust still clung to his clothes, and his hands bore fresh scratches from mending fences. "Riverbend belongs to Luke's kin," he said, voice low but steady as a mountain stream. "And by inheritance." To me, Carver turned, his smile faltering slightly at the sight of Gideon. "Ah, you must be the mysterious mountain man I've heard about." He recovered quickly, straightening his jacket. "But surely you understand. Possession requires proper documentation. The railroad has very specific interests in this valley." "Reckon your interests don't outweigh what's right," Gideon replied. His words were quiet, but they carried the weight of stone. Carver's smile vanished entirely. "I'll return with the proper papers," he said, replacing his hat. "Best start thinking about where you'll all go when that time comes." He turned on his heel and strode to his horse, dignity slightly ruffled. They watched him ride away, dust rising behind his horse's hooves. Only when he disappeared around the bend did the tension begin to ease from the kitchen. That evening, the widows and Gideon gathered around the supper table. The mood was different from the previous night, though worry about Carver's threat lingered. The walls of mistrust had begun to crack. Martha ladled out bowls of beans and cornbread, while Agnes passed a plate of fresh biscuits. Sarah poured coffee into tin cups, her movements less rigid than before. "Thank you," she said quietly to Gideon, "for standing up to him today." Gideon nodded, accepting the coffee. "Man like that, all shine and no substance. Seen his kind before." "But what if he comes back with papers?" asked Ruth, the second youngest widow. "What if the railroad really can take Riverbend?" "Then we'll face that too," Gideon replied, breaking a biscuit in half. "Luke trusted me to look after his kin. Ain't about to let some railroad man run you off your land." The women shared glances across the table, something new in their eyes. It wasn't trust, not completely. That would take more time. But hope had taken root, fragile as a spring seedling but growing stronger. The evening settled around them, warm lamplight glowing in the windows of Riverbend Ranch, while outside, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Dawn painted the sky in soft pastels as the Barlow widows began their daily chores at Riverbend Ranch. The rhythmic sound of milk hitting the tin pail echoed from the barn where Sarah worked, her capable hands moving with practiced efficiency. The morning air carried the sweet scent of fresh bread from the kitchen, where Ruth kneaded dough with gentle determination despite her failing eyesight. Through the kitchen window, Layla hummed a cheerful tune while washing dishes occasionally, calling out teasing remarks to Esther, who sat at the table carefully mending a torn shirt. Hannah, the youngest, swept the porch with nervous energy, pausing often to watch Gideon working on the fence line in the distance. "The man surely knows his way around ranch work," Sarah commented, entering the kitchen with 2 brimming pails of fresh milk. Her stern features softened slightly as she watched him drive another post into the ground. "The good Lord provides," Esther intoned, not looking up from her stitching. "We should thank him for sending Mr. Hawley to us in our hour of need." Leila rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Oh, Esther, must everything be his sermon? Though I reckon he is easy on the eyes, even with all that trail dust." "Layla," Ruth's gentle rebuke carried no real reproach, and even Sarah's lips twitched with amusement. Hannah paused in the doorway, clutching her broom. "Do you think he'll really stay? Help us keep the ranch?" The question sobered the group. Sarah squared her shoulders. "Time will tell. For now we've got work to do." The morning progressed steadily until just before noon, when excited shouts drew the women to the porch. One of their calves had wandered into the boggy area near the creek. Gideon was attempting to head it off, his horse picking its way carefully. Through the mud, the calf darted left, then right, bleeding in confusion. Gideon swung down from his saddle, hoping to guide it back to solid ground. Instead, his boots slipped in the thick mud, and he went down with a spectacular splash. The calf, startled by the commotion, bounded straight back toward the barn. Laughter erupted from the porch. Even Sarah couldn't maintain her stern expression at the sight of the dignified mountain man covered head to toe in creek mud. Gideon rose slowly, trying to maintain what was left of his dignity, but his lips twitched beneath his beard. "Reckon that's one way to catch a calf," he drawled, which only increased the laughter. That evening, the mood around the supper table was notably lighter. Ruth's fresh bread and a hearty pot of beans filled hungry stomachs while stories filled the air. The lamplight cast a warm glow over their faces as barriers slowly began to lower. "Tell us about Luke," Hannah asked quietly during a lull in conversation. "In the war, I mean. We know so little about those years." Gideon set down his coffee cup, his weathered face growing thoughtful. "Luke was the bravest man I ever knew," he began slowly. "Not because he wasn't scared, we were all scared, but because he never let fear stop him from doing what was right. He spoke of a night when Luke had crawled through enemy fire to drag 2 wounded men to safety. Didn't even know them," Gideon continued. "Said it didn't matter. Said a man's duty was to help those who needed helping." Tears glistened in the women's eyes. Sarah dabbed at hers with her apron, while Ruth reached over to squeeze Hannah's hand. Even Esther remained silent, letting the moment speak for itself. The peaceful mood shattered with a sudden knock at the door. A young boy from town stood on the porch, shifting nervously from foot to foot. He thrust a folded paper toward Sarah. "Pa said to deliver this right away, ma'am," he stammered, then turned and ran back to his waiting horse. Sarah unfolded the paper, her face growing pale as she read. The other women gathered close, their earlier warmth replaced by growing dread. 10 days. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're giving us 10 days to vacate the property. After that, they'll send men to remove us by force if necessary." Hannah sank into a chair while Esther began muttering prayers under her breath. Lila's usual smile vanished completely. "They can't do this," Ruth protested softly. "This is our home." Gideon took the notice, his eyes scanning the official text. His jaw tightened beneath his beard, but he kept his voice steady. "Railroads trying to scare you into running. Making threats is easier than proving their claim. But what can we do?" Hannah's voice quavered. "We're just 5 widows and a mountain man against the entire railroad company." Sarah straightened her shoulders, though fear still showed in her eyes. "We'll think of something. We have to." The group stayed gathered around the table long into the night, the railroad notice lying between them like a snake in their midst. The worn companionship of earlier had been replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock counting down their precious remaining days at Riverbend Ranch. Morning came too early to Riverbend Ranch. The sky still pearled with dawn when the widows climbed into their wagon. Gideon helped each woman up, his strong hands steady as they gathered their skirts. Sarah took the reins while Gideon mounted his horse alongside. The late summer air held a hint of autumn's chill as they set out for Silver Bluff. The wagon rattled over rutted roads, every bump and dip making the wooden wheels creak in protest. Ruth clutched her Bible in her lap while Esther led them in quiet hymns to pass the hours. Hannah dozed against Leila's shoulder, the gentle swaying of the wagon lulling her despite her worries. "Might want to slow a bit here," Gideon called out as they approached a rocky stretch. His horse picked its way carefully beside them, his eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead. The sun climbed higher, beating down on their backs as they made their slow progress toward town. By midday, Silver Bluff's weathered buildings came into view. The street was busy with townspeople going about their business, but conversations died as the wagon passed. Women whispered behind their hands while men stared openly, some with pity, others with barely concealed contempt. "Look at them Barlow widows," one woman said loudly enough to be heard, "thinking they can run a ranch all alone." Sarah's knuckles whitened on the reins, but she kept her chin high. Gideon rode closer to the wagon, his presence a silent shield. Against the stares and whispers, the courthouse stood at the end of the street, its wooden steps worn smooth by years of boot traffic. Gideon helped the women down from the wagon, then tied both his horse and their team to the hitching post. Together, they climbed the steps and entered the cool dimness of the courthouse dock. Judge Albright sat behind his desk, peering at them over wire-rimmed spectacles. His gray hair and lined face spoke of years weighing matters of law in this frontier town. He listened carefully as Sarah explained their situation, his expression giving nothing away. "The railroad's claim seems irregular," the judge said slowly, shuffling through the papers before him. "But I'll need more documentation before making any ruling. Property deeds, marriage certificates, proof of inheritance. How long?" Gideon's voice was quiet but firm. The judge removed his spectacles, polishing them with a cloth. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. These matters take time to sort properly. "The railroad's given us 10 days, Sarah protested, her voice tight with frustration. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Barlow," Judge Albright said, not unkindly. "But the law must follow its course. I suggest you gather whatever documents you can find." Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt harsh after the dim interior. The women's shoulders sagged with disappointment as they moved toward their wagon. A group of cowhands lounged against the general store's porch, watching their approach. "Well, if it ain't the widow women," one called out, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Might as well pack up now. Railroad's gonna run you off anyway." "Ain't natural, women trying to run a spread," another added with a laugh. "Need a man for that kind of work." Before any of the women could respond, Gideon stepped between them and the cowhands. His movement was casual, but there was nothing casual about the look in his eyes or the way his hand rested near his belt. "Reckon you boys might want to mind your manners," he said softly. The warning in his voice was clear as a rattler's shake. "These ladies are under my protection now." The cowhands shifted uneasily, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. They shuffled away, muttering under their breath, but careful not to meet Gideon's steady gaze. The journey home seemed longer, the wagon rolling through lengthening shadows as dusk approached. No one spoke much, each lost in their own worried thoughts. When they finally reached Riverbend, the ranch house stood dark and quiet against the purple sky. Gideon built up the fire while the women moved around the kitchen, preparing a simple supper. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as they gathered around the table, the day's disappointments weighing heavy in the air. Then Gideon did something unexpected. He removed his hat and bowed his head. "Lord," he began, his deep voice soft but clear, "we ask for your guidance in these troubled times. Give us strength to face what's coming and wisdom to find our way through." The widows exchanged surprised glances, then one by one bowed their heads. Sarah's hand found Ruth's. Ruth's reached for Hannah's, until they formed an unbroken circle. Around the table, "Amen," they whispered together when Gideon finished, and somehow the room felt warmer, the burden lighter for being shared. Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as Sarah stepped onto the front porch, her coffee cup warm in her hands. She stopped short, listening to the steady rhythm of hammering above. Looking up, she saw Gideon's boots first, then the rest of him stretched across the roof, replacing worn shingles with fresh-cut ones. "Been at it since before sunrise," Ruth said softly, joining Sarah on the porch. "I heard him sawing boards when I got up to start the bread." The other widows emerged one by one, watching as Gideon worked methodically, his movements sure and practiced. By breakfast time, the roof was sound again, ready for the coming autumn rains. Days settled into a comfortable pattern after that. Gideon rode out early to mend fences or check cattle, while the women divided their tasks with familiar efficiency. Sarah managed the books and livestock counts, Leela tended the kitchen garden, Ruth cooked and mended, and Esther kept the house in order. One afternoon, as Gideon helped Sarah count cattle in the south pasture, she noticed how his eyes tracked every detail, marking weak spots in the fence, noting which calves seemed strongest. "You've got a good eye for the work," she said. Surprised to find herself meaning it, Gideon just nodded, but his shoulders relaxed slightly at her words. That evening, as they sat around the supper table, Esther's hands trembled as she unfolded a stack of papers. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She spread out bills and promissory notes, some yellowed with age. "My Thomas, he borrowed more than I knew. The merchants in town, they've been patient, but how much?" Gideon asked quietly. When Esther named the sum, her cheeks flushed with shame. But Gideon simply nodded, making careful notes in his small leather book. "We'll find a way," he said. "Your family's honor matters." Tears spilled down Esther's cheeks as the other women gathered close, their hands gentle on her shoulders. The next day, Ruth struggled with the mending, squinting at the tiny stitches. Gideon noticed her pushing the work closer to her face, then farther away. "My eyes aren't what they used to be," she admitted when he paused beside her chair. "Some days it's like trying to thread a needle through fog." Without a word, Gideon moved her chair closer to the window, angling it so the light fell better on her work. It was a small gesture, but Ruth's grateful smile lit up her whole face. That night, Layla lingered in the kitchen after the others had gone to bed. Gideon found her there, staring into the dying fire. "Sometimes the quiet gets so loud," she said softly, not turning around. "My Joe, he used to fill every silence with dreams, gold in the hills, a grand house in town. Silly dreams, maybe, but they made the world feel bigger." Gideon said nothing, but he stayed, his presence solid and steady until Layla's shoulders stopped shaking. Days turned to weeks. The railroad deadline hung over them like a storm cloud, but daily life went on. The widows began to notice things about Gideon, how he always knocked the mud from his boots before entering, how he remembered which widow preferred coffee and which preferred tea, how he left fresh-cut kindling by the stove each morning. That one warm afternoon, Sarah heard something that made her pause in hanging laundry. Music, soft and hesitant, drifted from the barn. She found Gideon sitting on a hay bale, Luke's old fiddle tucked under his chin. His fingers moved carefully over the strings, drawing out the notes of amazing grace. The other widows appeared one by one, drawn by the melody. Leela hummed first, her clear voice rising sweetly. Ruth joined next, then Esther, their harmonies weaving together like threads in a tapestry. Even Sarah found herself joining in, remembering how Luke used to play this very tune on Sunday afternoons. Gideon's playing grew more confident as they sang, the music filling the barn with warmth and memory. When the last note faded, there were tears in more than one pair of eyes, but they were healing tears. That evening's supper was different. Stories flowed as freely as the coffee tales of Luke and his brothers, of dances and harvests, of hard times weathered together. Laughter rang out when Leela described teaching her Joe to dance, demonstrating his clumsy steps. Even Gideon smiled, a rare sight that transformed his weathered face. The railroad notice still lay in its drawer, its deadline drawing closer with each sunset. But as Sarah looked around the table that night, at Ruth showing Gideon her mother's biscuit recipe, at Esther leading Grace with a steadier voice, at Lila teaching Hannah a clapping game, she saw something she hadn't expected. A family pieced together from broken parts, growing stronger day by day. The summer sun beat down as Gideon rode the fence line. testing posts and mending loose wire. From his horse, he could see the ranch house in the distance, where colorful squares of fabric fluttered on the clothesline like prairie butterflies. Inside, the widows had spread scraps of cloth across the kitchen table, bits of calico, faded gingham, and flour sack cotton saved from better times. Their nimble fingers stitched new curtains while their minds wandered to brighter thoughts. "Remember the dances we used to have?" Lila sighed, holding up a piece of yellow cotton to the light. "How the lanterns would swing in the evening breeze, and the fiddle music would echo clear down to the creek." Sarah paused in her stitching, a rare smile touching her lips. Luke and his brothers would clear out the barn, sweep it clean as a church floor. "Why don't we have a dance now?" Hannah asked suddenly, her young face brightening. "Show folks we're not just poor widows hiding away." The other women stopped their sewing, looking at each other. The idea took root like spring wheat after rain. "We could string lanterns," Ruth offered softly. "Bake pies," Esther added, her eyes sparking with purpose. "But what about?" Sarah gestured toward the window where Gideon's distant figure moved along the fence line. "He'll just have to accept it," Leela declared, straightening her shoulders. "Besides, his fiddle playing has improved something considerable." When Gideon returned that evening, the women presented their plan. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking like they'd suggested flying to the moon. "A dance?" His voice was gruff with doubt. "With the railroad breathing down our necks?" "Because of that," Sarah said firmly, "we need to show we're still standing, still part of this community." Gideon studied their determined faces, then slowly nodded. "Reckon you're right about that." The next days buzzed with activity. The widows threw themselves into preparations with fierce joy. Ruth and Lila baked pies, apple, peach, and berry, their crusts golden and flaky. Esther and Hannah strung paper lanterns across the barn rafters, while Sarah organized the clearing of hay and equipment. Gideon worked alongside them, moving heavy things, fixing loose boards, and sometimes testing his fiddle strings in the evening. Though he said little, his actions spoke of support. Word spread across the valley. Some neighbors were skeptical. Widows hosting a dance seemed strange to them. But curiosity proved stronger than doubt. On the evening of the dance, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Lanterns swayed gently in the warm breeze, casting friendly light across the swept barn floor. The air filled with the sweet scent of pies cooling on makeshift tables. The first neighbors arrived cautiously, bearing dishes and uncertain smiles. Then more came, drawn by the warmth of welcome and the sound of tuning instruments. 3 local men had brought their guitars, and they nodded respectfully to Gideon as he took up his fiddle. The music started, slow, familiar hymns that everyone knew. Feet began tapping, hands clapping in time. Then the tunes quickened to jigs and reels that set boots stomping on the wooden floor. Gideon stood awkwardly at the edge, until Lila marched over and pulled him into a dance. His movements were stiff at first, but Lila's laughter seemed to ease something in him. When the song ended, Ruth claimed the next dance, then Esther, until each widow had taken a turn. Sarah was the last to dance with him. "Thank you," she said quietly as they moved across the floor, "for everything." Gideon just nodded, but his eyes were warmer than she'd ever seen them. Hannah flitted between groups of young people her age, her cheeks pink with excitement. Esther served pie with gracious dignity. Ruth taught children simple dance steps while Leila led the singing of old favorites. Neighbors who had been standing apart began to mingle, sharing news and memories. The railroad threat was mentioned, but not with fear, with determination to stand together. As the evening deepened, the music softened to gentle waltzes. The lantern light glowed like captured stars, and for a precious few hours, Riverbend Ranch was exactly what it had always been meant to be, a place of warmth, welcome, and community. Looking around the barn, Sarah saw more than just a dance. She saw healing happening in small ways, old grievances mending over shared pie, Lonely hearts finding comfort in familiar songs, and 5 widows standing tall, no longer defined by their losses but by their strength. The barn dance had done what? They hoped it showed everyone, including themselves, that Riverbend Ranch was still very much alive. The morning sun streamed through the newly hung curtains, catching dust motes that danced in its golden beams. The kitchen still held the warmth of yesterday's joy crumbs from the last pieces of pie, a forgotten hair ribbon under a chair, the faint echo of fiddle music in memory. Sarah hummed as she kneaded bread dough, her strong hands working the mixture with practiced ease. At the table, Leela and Ruth sorted through the remains of last night's gathering, while Esther helped Hannah wash dishes, their quiet chatter punctuated by occasional laughter. Gideon sat on the porch, whittling a new handle for the butter churn when the thunder of hooves broke the peaceful morning. Deputy Sloan rode up, his horse's hooves kicking dust into the air. The deputy's face wore a sneer as he dismounted, spurs jingling against the packed earth. "Got something here for you folk," Sloan announced, pulling a thick envelope from his rose vest. His voice carried enough that the women came to the door, clustering behind Gideon, who had risen to his feet. "These here are legal eviction papers," Sloan declared, slapping the envelope against his palm. "Railroads claiming this land always has been theirs. You got 3 days to clear out." Sarah stepped forward, her hands still dusted with flour. "That's impossible. This land belonged to the Barlows for 15 years. Sloan's laugh was harsh as a crow's call. "Ain't what the papers say, ma'am. Railroad had the claim first, your menfolk just squatted here." "That's a lie," Gideon said quietly, but his eyes had turned hard as flint. "Luke Barlow bought this land fair and square." "Then prove it," Sloan challenged, tossing the envelope at Gideon's feet. "Show me them papers. Otherwise I'm coming back. With men enough to clear this place out, and won't matter then how many barn dances you throw." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Gideon took a step forward, his hand dropping to his belt, but Sarah caught his arm. Sloan's hand had already moved to his gun. 3 days, the deputy repeated, backing toward his horse. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." They watched him ride away, the morning's peace shattered like a broken mirror. Sarah picked up the envelope with trembling hands, while the other women huddled closer, their faces pale with worry. "He can't do this," Leela whispered. "Can he?" Before anyone could answer, a sharp gasp drew their attention. Hannah stood swaying in the doorway, her face flushed an alarming red. "I don't feel," she started to say, then crumpled like a cut flower. "Hannah!" Esther caught her before she hit the floor. Gideon swept forward, lifting the young woman's slight form easily. Her skin burned against his arms as he carried her to her bed. "She's burning up," Ruth said, pressing a hand to Hannah's forehead. The young widow's breathing came in short, labored gasps, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "The doctor," Sarah said, wringing her hands. "We need Dr. Matthews." "He's at Fort Ransom," Lila reminded them, her voice tight with fear. "Won't be back for days." Hannah moaned, turning restlessly on the bed. Her face had gone from red to pale, except for 2 bright spots of color high on her cheeks. Gideon watched, the women trying to cool her with damp cloths, their movements growing more frantic as nothing seemed to help. A knock at the door made them all jump. Martha Wheeler, their closest neighbor, stood there with leftover pie plates from the dance. Her eyes widened at their obvious distress. "Hannah's sick," Ruth explained quickly. "Burning with fever, and the doctor's away at the fort." Martha's weathered face grew thoughtful. "There's that Apache healer, lives across the river. They say she knows every healing plant in these hills." The women exchanged uncertain glances. They'd heard of the healer woman, but none had ever sought her help. Years of distrust and prejudice rose up like a wall. "We can't just," Esther began, but another cry from Hannah cut her off. "I'll go," Gideon said firmly, already reaching for his hat. Ain't got time for old fears when a life's at stake. Sarah nodded slowly, seeing the sense in his words. The eviction papers. We'll wait, Gideon finished. Hannah needs help now. He strode out to saddle his horse, his movements quick and purposeful. The women gathered on the porch, watching him prepare to ride. The morning that had started so hopefully now felt heavy with twin burdens, the threat to their home and Hannah's. Mysterious illness. What if the healer won't come? Lila voiced what they were all thinking. She'll come, Gideon said, swinging into the saddle. I'll make sure of it. They watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the vast landscape. Behind them, Hannah's feverish murmurs drifted from the open window. Sarah squeezed Ruth's hand, drawing strength from the contact. We need to pray, Esther said. Softly, for Hannah, for our home, for Gideon's safe return. The women bowed their heads right there on the porch, their whispered prayers, carrying on the wind that had so recently held music and laughter. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft strokes of pink and gold as Gideon tightened the cinch on his saddle. The morning air held a bite that warned of coming autumn, and his breath fogged in small clouds as he worked. His horse stamped restlessly, sensing the urgency in his movements. Inside the ranch house, a lamp still burned in Hannah's room. Her fever had grown worse through the night, and Gideon could hear the low murmur of prayer as the women tended to her. The sound strengthened his resolve. He mounted up and pointed his horse east, toward the reservation lands where the Apache made their home. The sun climbed slowly behind him as he rode, casting his shadow long across the ground. The first challenge came at Broken Creek, usually little more than a trickle this time of year. Recent rains had swollen it into a rushing torrent. Gideon dismounted, leading his horse carefully along the bank until he found a crossing where the water ran wider but shallower. The horse fought him at first, not liking the fast water, but Gideon's steady hand on the reins guided them both safely across. The trail wound through narrow canyons, where the walls rose steep and close. Here and there, Gideon spotted pictographs, painted on the rock, ancient stories he couldn't read, but respected all the same. The passage was tight enough that he had to dismount again, leading his horse through the narrowest spots. By late afternoon, the canyons opened into rolling hills, dotted with juniper and pine. Smoke from cooking fires rose in thin columns against the darkening sky. Gideon approached slowly, knowing better than to ride straight into an Apache camp uninvited. Two riders appeared suddenly from behind an outcropping. Rifles ready, they spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing for him to stop. Gideon raised his hand slowly, showing he carried no weapon. I knew Luke Barlow, he said clearly. I seek the healer called Nalin. A young woman is very sick. The riders exchanged looks. The older of the two studied Gideon's face before nodding slowly. I remember you, he said in careful English. You came with Luke 3 summers ago. The white man who did not speak much. Relief washed through Gideon. That's right. Follow, the rider commanded, wheeling his horse around. The camp spread out in a protected valley, with wooden frameworks covered in hides and canvas forming family shelters. Children stopped their play to watch him pass, and women paused in their work, their dark eyes following his progress. They led him to a shelter set slightly apart from the others. Smoke curled from a small fire out front, carrying the sharp scent of medicinal herbs. An older woman emerged, her silver hair bound back in a long braid, her face deeply lined but her eyes sharp and alert. Nalin, the rider said, gesturing to Gideon. He comes seeking medicine, friend of Luke Barlow. The healer's gaze was penetrating as she studied him. Luke Barlow showed respect, she said finally. He learned our ways of healing plants. Why do you come? Gideon explained about Hannah's fever, describing her symptoms as carefully as he could. Nalin listened intently, nodding occasionally. Without a word, she disappeared into her shelter and began gathering items into a small leather pouch. These herbs must be brewed into tea, she instructed, measuring out portions of dried leaves and roots. 3 times each day until the fever breaks. Keep her cool with wet cloths. If the fever has not broken in 2 days, return. Gideon took the pouch carefully, tucking it into his shirt. Thank you, he said simply. Nalin held his gaze. Luke Barlow spoke of you. Said you were a man who kept his word. Now you watch over his family? They're not my family, Gideon said quietly. Just women I inherited with his ranch. The old woman's laugh was like dry leaves rustling. Family is not who you are born to, she said, her voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. Family is who you choose to carry, like a burden that becomes a blessing. She touched the medicine pouch through his shirt. You choose to carry these women, whether you know it yet or not. The words struck Gideon like a physical blow. He thought of the widows, their strength, their fear, their tentative trust in him. Something shifted in his heart, subtle but significant. Night was falling as he mounted up again. The return journey would be treacherous in the dark, but Hannah couldn't wait until morning. Nalin watched him prepare to leave, her expression knowing. The medicine will heal her body, she called as he turned his horse. But it is your presence that will heal their hearts. Gideon rode through the darkness, letting his horse pick its way carefully along the trail. The moon rose, casting enough light to navigate by, though the canyons were black as pitch. He crossed the creek again, the water somehow feeling colder in the night. His thoughts kept returning to Nalin's words about family and choice. He'd spent so many years alone in his mountain cabin, carrying only his own burdens. Now he carried 5 women's hopes, fears, and futures. The weight should have felt crushing, but somehow it made him feel more whole than he had in years. The stars wheeled overhead as he pushed on through the night, the medicine pouch pressed close to his heart, carrying healing for more than just Hannah's fever. The first rays of sunlight were breaking over the eastern hills when Gideon's exhausted horse plodded into the ranch yard. His muscles ached from the long night ride, but urgency drove him forward as he dismounted stiffly and hurried toward the house. The precious medicine pouch clutched in his hand. Sarah met him at the door, her usual stern expression cracked by worry and fatigue. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, telling of a sleepless night. Hannah's worse, she whispered. The fever's climbing. Inside, the house smelled of fear and sickness. The other widows huddled in the kitchen, their faces drawn with exhaustion. They'd taken turns through the night, keeping cool claws on Hannah's burning forehead and praying in whispered voices. Gideon strode to the kitchen stove, where a pot of water already simmered. With careful movements, he opened the leather pouch and measured out the dried herbs Nalin had given him. The pungent scent of medicinal plants filled the air as he added them to the water. Apache medicine? Sarah asked, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. Gideon nodded. From a healer who knew Luke, she said to give it 3 times daily until the fever breaks. While the tea steeped, he went to Hannah's bedside. The young woman lay still as death, her face flushed with fever, her breathing shallow and rapid. Esther sat beside her, dabbing her forehead with a damp cloth and murmuring prayers. Let's get her sitting up, Gideon said softly. Together, they raised Hannah's limp form, supporting her while he held the cup of medicine to her parched lips. Drink, child, he urged, using a gentleness that surprised even him. This will help. Throughout the day, they maintained their vigil. The widows moved quietly through their chores, returning often to check on Hannah. Gideon brewed fresh medicine every few hours, marking time by the sun's passage across the sky. As afternoon waned, he found himself alone with Hannah. Settling into the chair beside her bed, he did something he hadn't done since the war. He prayed aloud. His voice was rough with disuse, but the words came from deep within. Lord, he began, I ain't much for asking favors, but this girl needs your help. These women need your strength. And he paused, throat tight, I need your guidance to be what they need me to be. The room grew dim as sunset approached. Hannah stirred, her breathing changing. Sarah appeared in the doorway just as the young woman's eyes fluttered open, clear and focused for the first time in days. "Water?" Hannah whispered. The word sparked a flurry of activity. The other widows rushed in, tears of joy streaming down their faces as they helped Hannah sip from a cup. Her skin was cool to the touch, the fever had broken. Relief swept through the house like a cleansing wind. The women embraced each other, laughing and crying at once. Gideon stood back, watching their joy with a full heart. Later that evening, after Hannah had eaten a little broth and fallen into natural sleep, the widows gathered in the main room. The lamp cast warm light across their faces as they sat in a circle, the day's tension finally easing from their shoulders. "We owe you a debt, Gideon Hawley," Sarah said, her usual sharpness softened by gratitude. "You rode through the night to save our Hannah." "Weren't nothing," he mumbled, uncomfortable. "With praise." "It was everything," Leela corrected gently. "You've become our protector, whether you meant to or not." Ruth nodded, her quiet voice carrying weight. "More than that. You're family now." The word hung in the air, reminding Gideon of Nalan's wisdom about choosing who to carry. He looked at each woman in turn: Sarah with her hard-won strength, Esther's steady faith, Lila's quick smile, Ruth's gentle wisdom, and Hannah, now sleeping peacefully in the next room. Somewhere along the way, they had indeed become his family. "The railroad deadline's still coming," he said gruffly, trying to hide how moved he was. 4 days left. "Then we'll face it together," Sarah declared, reaching out to squeeze his calloused hand. "As family." The others nodded in agreement, and Gideon felt something shift inside him, the last walls around his heart crumbling away. These women had claimed him as surely as he had chosen to carry them. Whatever came next, they would meet it as one household, one family. Outside, a coyote called to the rising moon, its song carrying across the quiet ranch. Inside, the lamp burned warm and steady, illuminating this newfound family as they sat together, drawing strength from their unity, even as the shadow of the railroad's threat loomed over their future. Morning sun streamed through the barn's weathered boards as Gideon climbed the ladder to the musty loft. Dust motes danced in the golden shafts of light. In the corner sat Luke's old trunk, its brass fittings dulled by years of neglect. Gideon ran his hand over the worn leather, remembering how Luke had carried it through their war years together. The hinges creaked as he lifted the lid. The familiar scent of cedar and old paper wafted up, stirring memories. A faded blue uniform lay folded on top, still bearing the marks of battle and march. Beneath it, letters tied with faded ribbon spoke of connections to home during those dark years. Gideon lifted each item with careful hands, laying them aside with reverence. Here was Luke's journal, its pages yellow with age. There, a daguerreotype of Luke's parents, their stern faces gazing out from beneath the clouded glass. A handful of Confederate bullets they'd collected after Shiloh. A pressed flower, crumbling with age, that Luke had sent to his sweetheart. "Need any help up there?" Sarah's voice carried from below. "No, ma'am," Gideon called back. "Just sorting through some memories." His fingers brushed against something at the bottom of the trunk. A leather portfolio, its surface cracked but still supple. Inside, yellowed papers crackled as he unfolded them carefully. His heart began to pound as he read the flowing script. Land deeds, purchase agreements, survey maps, all bearing Luke's signature and official stamps from the territorial office. The dates jumped out at him. 1863, years before the railroad had pushed its way through these lands. "Sarah," his voice cracked with excitement, "all of you, come see this." The widows climbed the ladder one by one, gathering around as Gideon spread the papers on the wooden floor. Sarah adjusted her spectacles, leaning close to read. "Luke bought this land fair and square," Gideon explained, his finger tracing the dates. "Look here, paid in gold, registered with the territory. The railroad can't claim what was already Sold. Praise the Lord, Esther whispered. Clasping her hands together, Ruth touched the papers reverently. All this time, the proof was right here. We need to get these to Silver Bluff, Lila said, her eyes bright with hope. Show that railroad man he can't push us around. Hannah, still pale but recovering, smiled. Luke was watching over us even. After he was gone, Gideon gathered the precious papers carefully. These need cleaning and pressing before we present them. Can't have them looking like they've been in a trunk for 10 years. The women sprang into action. They carried the documents to the house, clearing the kitchen table. Sarah brought out clean cloths and warm water. With gentle touches, they cleaned. Years of dust from the papers, working carefully to preserve every word and seal. The good Lord provides, Esther murmured as she worked. In His own time, He provides. When the papers were clean, Ruth brought out the family Bible, a massive, leather-bound volume that had seen generations of Barlows come and go. They laid the documents between its pages, using its weight to press them flat. Seems fitting, Sarah observed, using the good book to protect our home. They gathered around the table, these 6 unlikely family members, looking at the Bible. With its precious contents, Gideon felt something swell in his chest, pride, perhaps, or gratitude. Luke had known what he was doing, leaving everything in order. He'd protected his family even after death. We'll ride to Silver Bluff tomorrow, Gideon said. Show these to the judge first thing. All of us? Hannah asked. All of us, he confirmed. This is our home. We'll stand together to defend it. Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand, her usual sternness softened by emotion. Luke chose well. When he made you his heir, he chose well with all of us, Gideon replied gruffly, making us a family. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, warming the kitchen. Outside, a meadowlark called, its sweet song carrying hope on the breeze. The Bible lay on the table, protecting their future within its pages. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but today, faith and hope mingled in the air like a blessing. They left the papers to press, each returning to their evening chores with lighter hearts. Gideon paused at the door, looking back at the Bible on the table. Luke had known, somehow he had known, that these papers would be needed. That this unlikely family would need the protection they offered. Thank you, old friend, he whispered, then stepped out into the golden afternoon light, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Gideon helped the widows into the wagon. Sarah clutched the leather portfolio containing Luke's precious documents to her chest, while Ruth and Esther settled the younger women between them on the wooden bench. The Bible lay wrapped in clean muslin beneath the seat, ready as witness if needed. Dew sparkled on the grass as Gideon hitched the team. His own mount, a sturdy bay, would follow behind. The morning air held a hint of autumn crispness, carrying the scent of sage and distant wood smoke. As he climbed onto the driver's seat beside Sarah, the first rays of sun broke over the horizon. Lord be with us, Esther murmured, and the others echoed quiet amens. The wagon wheels creaked as they started down the rutted road toward Silver Bluff. Every mile seemed to stretch longer than usual, the tension growing with each turn of the wheels. Hannah hummed hymns softly, her voice barely carrying over the wagon's steady motion. Leela kept smoothing her skirts, a nervous habit that spoke of her anxiety. They passed other travelers on the road, ranchers driving cattle, merchants with supply wagons, a mail carrier on his tired horse. Each encounter brought curious stares. At the sight of 5 women and 1 man traveling together, Sarah kept her chin high, ignoring the looks, while Gideon's watchful eyes missed nothing. The sun climbed higher as Silver Bluff's buildings came into view. By mid-morning, dust from the street settled on their Sunday best as Gideon helped the women down from the wagon. They made quite a sight. 6 determined figures walking toward the courthouse, their boots and shoes raising little puffs of dirt with each step. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with activity. Townsfolk filled the wooden benches, whispering behind raised hands as Gideon and the widows entered. Near the front, Carver lounged in his fine suit, a superior smile playing at his lips. Deputy Sloan stood near him, hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt as he glared at Gideon. Judge Albright sat behind his massive oak desk, his face carefully neutral as he observed the gathering crowd. When Gideon approached, the judge's eyes flickered to the women standing proudly behind him. "We're here about Riverbend Ranch," Gideon stated, his voice carrying in the sudden hush. Carver stepped forward, smooth as a rattler. "Your Honor, the railroad's claim is clear. We have surveys and territorial grants." "If I may," Gideon interrupted, nodding to Sarah. She stepped forward, opening the portfolio with steady hands. "These documents," Gideon continued, laying them carefully on the judge's desk, show Luke Barlow purchased Riverbend Ranch in 1863. Full payment in gold, registered with the territorial office, and witnessed by 2 officials. A murmur rippled through the courthouse as Judge Albright adjusted his spectacles. Carver's smile faltered as he craned his neck to see. Deputy Sloan shifted uneasily, his hand dropping from his gun belt. "These dates," the judge said slowly, "predate any railroad claim by several years." He held one document up to the light, examining the territorial seal. "The authenticity appears sound." "Impossible." Carver snapped, his composure cracking. "Those must be forgeries." "The seals and signatures are genuine," Judge Albright replied. "I recognize Judge Thompson's mark. He served on this bench before me." He shuffled through the papers, nodding. "Everything appears to be in order." Gasps and whispers filled the room. Carver's face had gone red, while Deputy Sloan looked increasingly uncomfortable. The widows stood straighter, hope brightening their faces. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I have here witness statements from 1863 confirming the sale. Luke Barlow's ownership is uncontested." He looked up, his gaze stern. "The railroad's claim is hereby dismissed. Riverbend Ranch belongs to the Barlow estate, now legally transferred to Mr. Hawley as executor." Relief swept through Gideon like a cool breeze. Behind him, he heard Esther's quiet "Praise be" and Hannah's muffled sob of joy. Sarah's hand found his arm and squeezed gently. Carver stormed forward, jabbing a finger at the documents. "This isn't over. We'll appeal. You'll do no such thing," Judge Albright cut in. "These deeds are ironclad. Any further harassment of Riverbend Ranch or its residents will be met with legal consequences." He fixed Carver with a stern look. "Do I make myself clear?" The railroad agent's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he turned on his heel and stalked out, Deputy Sloan trailing in his wake like a whipped cur. Outside the judge's chambers, Carver's face turned purple with rage. He pulled a thick wallet from his coat. "Name your price," he hissed at Judge Albright. "Everyone has one." Several townsfolk who had gathered in the hallway gasped. Judge Albright drew himself up to his full height. "That sounds remarkably like attempted bribery of a territorial judge," he said coldly. "I suggest you leave now, before I have you arrested." The widows clustered together, tears streaming down their faces as they embraced. Hannah buried her face in Sarah's shoulder, while Esther lifted her hands in silent prayer. Even stern Sarah's eyes glistened with joy. Deputy Sloan, seeing which way the wind blew, edged away from Carver and slipped out the courthouse door. The gathered townspeople who had once whispered cruel judgments about helpless widows now nodded respectfully. As Gideon led the women outside, several men touched their hat brims in greeting. Gideon's weathered face remained steady, though his eyes held a quiet triumph as justice prevailed over railroad greed. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Riverbend Ranch as evening settled in. Fresh-cut lumber gleamed on the mended fences, and the newly repaired barn door swung true on its hinges. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, their bells tinkling softly on the evening breeze. On the wide front porch, laughter rang out as Hannah chased little ones from the neighboring farms who had come to play. The sound echoed off the weathered walls of the ranch house, bringing life to a place that had known too much silence. Inside, lamplight warmed the kitchen where all five widows bustled about, setting out steaming dishes on the long oak table. The aroma of fresh bread and stewed beef filled the air. Gideon stood in the doorway, his rough hands clean but still bearing the honest dirt of daily work. His eyes took in the scene before him, this unexpected family he had inherited along with the land. As they gathered around the table, Gideon's gravelly voice caught with emotion as he bowed his head. "Lord," he began, his words coming slow but sure, "thank you for second chances, for family found when least expected, for bringing light back to this home." Sarah, sitting to his right, watched him with softened eyes. When the prayer ended, she could not help but smile. "Well, Gideon Halley," she murmured, just loud enough for all to hear, "turns out you really could handle all five of us after all." The widows burst into laughter, clinking their tin cups together in celebration. The firelight danced across their faces, highlighting the joy that had replaced their former fears. In that moment, with the warmth of kinship surrounding them, hope for tomorrow burned as bright as the evening star rising over Riverbend Ranch. If today's story echoed in your heart, I hope you'll stick around. Subscribe, and I'll be here again tomorrow with another story that speaks softly but stays deeply.